Conversations on Effective Conservation with Charles Wells. The Functioning of African Parks, Origins, Vision, Principles, Challenges, and Results.
Okay, so why African parks? Just a little bit of a background. So as we mentioned earlier, founded in 2000, although our first park, we just celebrated 20 years of Majetti. We've got our Majetti colleagues here. So that's obviously been 20 years was 2003, but African Parks was founded a bit before that. Just took a while to actually get a park that could manage. And if you ask Peter, I mean, unfortunately he couldn't make here to tell you sort of anecdotally all the stories of those early days. But he says it was a sort of a no-brainer, or it didn't really require much thought. When he was at school, they had a 2,000 hectare game reserve attached to their school, which the schoolboys used to manage. So, he said, why not? If you can do it with a few schoolboys next to the school, why not just do it on a larger scale? And that's what really, so from those days of school, he just thought, we can expand on this. He did obviously have experience with Sand Parks, and I'll get a little bit to who was part of that start and why those people were important. But the whole model was also based on the premise that it's difficult for public entities to expand their management. So first of all, funding is a big issue, which is obviously one of our large value adds that we give, our value propositions, is we bring the funding. But also even national wildlife services that do a great job are limited by their borders, because if you South African national parks, you can't then manage Botswana national parks, for instance, because by its very nature you're a national entity or sovereign entity. Whereas if you're independent, private, you can then go across borders like any multinational company. For instance, you can't have the US Navy running the British Navy, for instance, because it's a national asset. So that's a similar concept with parks, whereas you can have a private entity that can move across borders and then obviously, as I say, provide the funding. So also where we've got very progressive governments that we work with, they also recognize the flexibility and that a private organization can have. So for instance, in Rwanda, which is very progressive, they want to get things done, they realize the importance. I mean, they'll just say straight, we want African parks here because you're not limited by government bureaucracy like we are as a government institution. And just by its nature, I think even the most sort of flexible, nimble government agencies are still bureaucratic. They still have a lot of processes that they have to get through to get things done, whereas they can give it to us and we can just get on the ground and make things happen. And they recognize that, and so, that's why they bring us in as well. And then there's obviously the technical skills. Now, a lot of countries have those technical skills, so maybe that's probably the last one. I mean, we like to think we've got those good management skills, but there are a lot of those skills in country. But I think it's more the money and the flexibility and the agility that we can bring, as well as being transboundary.
I remember talking to Peter about this on an amazing interview, and he said something that I never thought about. And I was like, wow, this guy is great. He talked about accountability and how, okay, if you are the government and you create the rules and you are the owner and all that, but at the same time you have to manage and you have to control yourself. It's very easy to cheat because, okay, this is the park, this is the management plan, this is the way it should be done, and then someone has to implement that, and then you have to assess that. Like, it's like a student doing an exam and then
walking there.
Yeah, exactly. A plus, always A plus, because you are the implementer and the assessor at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
Which in business is very clear because you get these consultants that and they make an audit. Okay,
yeah.
They audit you and they say, yeah, he's doing well, yeah. But the government is very bad in audit itself. Yeah. So.
And also in business, I mean, obviously not every business, but most of it, you've got your shareholders. Either it's a public listed company with public shareholders, even a private company's got shareholders, so they hold the management team accountable. And that's similar to us, where our government is like 100% shareholder, but they, in a business sense, are a shareholder holding us accountable to deliver on the results, like you would in industry, So exactly that. It's also then you've got very, very clear accountability, which make sure that we perform, but also you don't have the government sort of being judge and jury of their own policy.
Jury, yeah.
So just also then why it started, who is it, and why it started in Malawi and Lua in Zambia. So the people that started there was Peter Fernhead, who's still our CEO, for those of you who don't know, who really has been driving it. Mavuso Msamang, who was the CEO of Sand Parks and worked with Peter and also was part of that vision and also had quite good political connections. Then Anthony Hall Martin, who was, if you haven't heard of him, very well known in Conservation Africa. He's passed away now, but he drove a lot of the rhino expansion programs, a lot of the first elephant reintroductions. So had a lot of credibility, which also helped get us started. And also was well known in Malawi, which is also why I get to, Malawi is where we started. Michael Eustace, also just a passionate conservationist and also had some influence there. And then very critically, Paul van Vlissingen was a very wealthy Dutch philanthropist who provided the initial funding. So we needed that money, and I'll get to just a bit early on, the sort of 3 M's that we talk about, but money being one of them, because obviously without that, we'd be hamstrung.
Charles, when I heard about this from Peter, and I've used this in presentations, this is an amazing example of diverse leadership and one complementing the other. You have kind of the strategist, Peter Fernhead, the guy who knew about management of protected areas. Then you have a politician well connected with the ANC, who went in exile, then came back with good diplomatic relationships outside, but powerful in the party, so that gave you political support. Then you have the respected ecologists there, great. So it's like you are doing Ocean's 11 here, like the big team there. Michael Eustace, I don't get it so much, okay? Yeah. And then you have the rich guy, okay? Yeah. The guy with the money, but also probably with good business acumen, because probably that's how he made money. Yeah. So it's like a top-notch team designing and getting the best of different worlds, okay? Compare that with a typical NGO created by 2 biologists. Yeah. Okay? They don't know about business, they don't know about politics, and we think we are going to save the planet. Okay? And you can go to the opposite extreme, only business people. They don't know about anything about ecology, they don't know about public management, because one thing is business and another thing is governments, and that's what Peter, I'm sure, he knew, he has experience.
Exactly, yeah.
So this is an amazing example of complementary leadership.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thanks for that. Yeah, that's a very good point. And also gave us a road into Malawi where Majeti is, because Anthony was well known then. Mavuso also a little bit had the political credibility to start negotiations there. But actually we wanted Lewande, which was sort of the flagship park in Malawi, and it's a national park. Majeti is actually not a national park, it's a wildlife reserve, so it's not actually classified as a national park. So when we first went in there and first started knocking on the door, we were after Lewande. But they weren't keen to, obviously we weren't tested, we hadn't proven ourselves yet, so they were very reluctant to give us a full national park. But there was a very sort of also far-thinking visionary guy, Leonard Sefu, who was the Director General of DNPW, and he also had the vision to give us a chance, and he also thought we've got to do something different. So he also opened the door and actually is a bit of an unsung hero in the story as well. He doesn't also always get the limelight, but he gave us the first opportunity. But he said, rather give us Majeti, which is a wildlife reserve and not a national park. It was completely degraded. So you kind of felt we couldn't make it worse than what it was, but gave us that opportunity. And obviously then we took it over, and Majeti is arguably now almost the flagship, definitely competing with Lewande. If you ask the Majeti management, they'll say it's better than Lewande. But definitely, I mean, the wildlife there is fantastic now. It's really well managed. The tourism there is we actually get more tourists there now than Lewande. So it's really been a huge success story and really proven our model. And then subsequent to that, we actually do manage Lewande now as well. Once we've proven we could do it in Majeti, we do Lewande and in Kota Kota. And then there's an area on Lewande called Mangochi. So basically there's 4 protected areas in Malawi, which started with Majeti.
I think that's also a very important lesson. You usually don't start with the best or what you want, you start with what is possible and you build up from there.
And then Lua was also interesting because Lua was also driven also by DNPW, Department of National Parks and Wildlife, or in those days it was ZAU, the Zambian Wildlife Authority, I think it was, but it was... But also very interesting, the BRE, the Barotse Royal Establishment. So that's actually the community that's had rights to that land for decades, if not centuries. They've got established fishing rights. And they've actually, it's almost been like a protected area by their royalty for many years. I mean, Henry, maybe you can jump in here. But they also realized that it needed protection. So it's actually one of our few agreements. We always have community consultation or community representation on boards, for instance. But this is one of the few where the BRE is actually a signature to the mandate, to our mandate to manage Lua, which is quite an interesting one as well. And that was, in fact, actually was signed just before Majetti, although officially Majetti was sort of publicized before, so we make Majetti our first. But Lua was basically around about the same time. And also very good relationship there with the BRE to this day, and very strong supporters of ours.
What's the BRE?
The Barotse Royal Establishment. So it's the community. So the Barotse is the name of the community, and the Royal Establishment. It's still got a king and a royal hierarchy.
Okay,
there.
so it's a community governance structure. Okay.
Yeah. Well, there is community governance structures, but the community actually signed our mandate to manage Lua with DMPW. So there's 3 signatories on the mandate, which is us, the BRE, and DMPW in Zambia. So quite an interesting model there, where the community is actually directly kind of holding us accountable. We got, Okay, so then just some of the fundamentals, and this is also a little bit of the lessons learned and coming through as I talk here. But you've got to have a long-term commitment. We try and get at least 20 years in our mandates, in our signatories, with the feeling that I think anything less than that is you're not going to have time to make those impacts, as I'm sure all of you know. When it comes to ecology and ecosystems, and that it takes a while for them to really sort of recover and become productive again. And so our feeling is that we need 20 years. Sometimes we get 10 years, but then with an option to renew again. But anything less than that, it's not really worth committing and getting established if you don't have that long-term commitment. Avoid the gray area. Now, this is actually a very interesting one, because I think it's something that we get quite a lot of criticism for. Is that we take control of law enforcement. And people say, does that not either we become paramilitary, or we're doing government's job for them, or isn't that, from the people at least sort of sympathetic, isn't that an increased risk for you? And our view is it's actually the opposite. If you look at WWF and all the issues they had with the BuzzFeed thing, they were providing food and support and equipment for rangers, but had no control over those rangers. And when they had the human rights abuse, it fell back on WWF. So I think not having control doesn't, eliminate that responsibility, but you don't have any way of controlling it. So we need to have direct control over law enforcement. That means we're fully accountable for sure, but it also means we can have a lot more control over what those rangers are doing. And obviously that's on the positive side. We'd like to think most of the time with incentives and rewards and progress, but it does also mean that if someone steps out of line, that we can then take action and hopefully prevent it. But in the worst case scenario where it hasn't been prevented, take action and get rid of that person who, and especially when it comes to human rights abuses. And
can you explain briefly what happened with WWF? Because probably most of us don't know exactly the story, and probably it's a story that went through Africa.
Yeah, so I don't know all the details, but basically in DRC there was they were supporting rangers, but as I say, they weren't managing them. They were providing food and rations and equipment and things for the rangers. The rangers ended up beating community members, and so sort of gross human rights abuse, and then it just hit the media, and it went sort of viral in terms of the accusations across the world. But on WWF, it didn't fall back on the wildlife authorities or anything like that. And so they lost huge amounts of funding, from all big state entities pulled their funding because they were accusing WWF of human rights abuses of communities with their rangers, and had a huge impact on them. In fact, even some of our funding is now under question because of that human rights abuse and those allegations. And they weren't actually even directly their rangers; they were just rangers that they were supporting through as a third party. A good lesson learned there, that you can't have these grey areas in your agreements with government.
So in the future, in the same area, you are going to try to change the contract to avoid those grey areas. So
with Kafui, for instance, we've changed it completely where it's very clear, because Kafui is also in Zambia but signed after Bangwelu, and we've learned from Bangwelu, and so it's very clear in the Kafui agreement. And we're also trying to renegotiate we're getting a letter like as an addendum to the mandate for Bangwelu. And then quite interestingly, Lavushimanda, which is actually the national park adjacent to the GMA, is also a possible potential for us to take over. And if we get that, we'll then amalgamate in one agreement with a very clear law enforcement in the mandate. So that's also lessons learned there. Revenue reinvested in the project, so that's very fundamental for both our credibility but also for donors. So any revenue that's generated from the project gets put straight back into the project, and we have been accused of all sorts of things, but one of them is that we're actually running it as a profit and we take in revenue from the park outside the country, but absolutely not. Every single bit of dollar that's generated in the parks put back into the park. Ian is going to have an interesting problem in Akagera where we might generate excess revenue for the first time just because they've done so well there. But even then it'll flow to government. But, ultimately we don't want, we say the donor dollar is the last dollar. So we want to first use the money we've generated by the park, and then whatever gap we've still got is then we go back to donors. And hopefully in a place like Akagera we can get to be self-sustaining where the park can generate its own revenue. But some of them, Garamba in DRC or Chinko in Central African Republic, there's literally zero revenue generated at this stage. So we're fully reliant on donors. But Rwanda, Malawi, Zambia, where we do have good revenue streams, we can get to that point where they're self-sustaining or largely self-sustaining. Management conducted within the national legislation. So we don't set policy, we don't make laws, we implement on behalf of government, which again does lead to some criticism. For instance, a lot of criticism for allowing, say, indigenous peoples access to land, which is a whole topic on its own, which we can get into a little bit. And we're saying, well, why did we don't, keep people out of this? And, we don't make the laws. The parks would proclaim, the government proclaims the land, and we just affected. Obviously, though, within the respect of established use rights. So again, back to the Lua example, where there is established use fishing rights, Bangwelu, those people can still continue fishing in the park. They can still continue to graze cattle in Lua, for instance, because there's established rights that they've had. So while we don't debate the boundaries of a national park, where there is traditional use rights, we obviously honor those. And in fact, I think is one of the best value adds we can have community is protecting local communities' rights from outsiders. Because often what happens is you get people from outside. I mean, an example is, for instance, in Enedi in Chad, where you've got wealthy people from N'Djamena with cattle that they're now pushing into the park for water. In Iona, in Angola, same story. You've got goats and cattle that are owned by people in the capital who are wealthy, and those are just their side businesses. And then they compromise local communities' rights to grazing. So actually, by protecting those resources, we're actually also helping the local communities with their traditional rights to those resources. Yeah. Actually, surprising a lot in all 22 parks that we manage, people either have access to resources in those parks, and a large number of them we've actually got people living in the park. So Lua, there's people living in the park. Bangwelu, there's people that live in the park. Matusodona, there's people living in the park. And Enedi, the list goes on. Iona, Garamba not in the park, but in the domain de chasse, Kafui in the game management area. So actually surprising a large number of our parks, not our parks, of the parks under our management. We have people living in the parks, and definitely not. We wouldn't relocate those people. Again, just to be perfectly open, there is one or two cases where there's a government plan to relocate. So there's a village called Bond Village in Zakuma, which is in the park, and we wouldn't move them, but the government does have plans to move them. Now, us being involved in the management, it is going to be tricky because no doubt we'll have to get involved there. And then we'll make sure it's done properly and there's proper, relocation plans and agreements from the community. Whether it actually happens or not, I'm not sure. I mean, it's definitely not something we're pushing. It's a government initiative, but unfortunately, we'll probably have to get pulled into it. But that's a fairly unique case. In most cases, we quite happily people continue to live in the park. But then there is a lot of work we've got to do to work with those communities. So, for instance, in Lua, They restricted agriculture to sort of 500 meters around the village. The village sizes are restricted. So, and again, it's to stop outsiders coming in and flocking there. They are allowed to graze cattle, but there's quite a complex human-wildlife conflict policy there. Because if they're not grazing cattle out in the park and left unattended at night and a lion attacks them, then we can't be held liable. However, if they're in their kraal and they're properly protected and a lion gets to them, then we will look at some sort of compensation. And there's a whole policy there we've set up with the community. So it requires quite active management, but definitely not a relocation in those cases. It's a huge challenge. I mean, there's two aspects to that. The one is to just restrict it, like we said, like you can't have foreigners coming to live. So we do a census, and I mean, we've got natural growth of children in the village, but at least you don't have influx of foreigners. And I mean, we also talk about the honeypot effect. If now it's nice to live in that village because you've got access to resources, you've got law enforcement around you, so you're quite safe from other people, which is actually quite a benefit we bring to a lot of these areas, then people want to come live there. So we call it the honeypot, like the honeypot attracting the bees. But you can restrict it at least in terms of like the amount of agriculture, the amount of buildings. The other is to try and provide incentives for people to move out. And one of them is education, because the reality is a lot of those villages, although they might be surviving, they're still subsistence farmers or living on a very low base. And because they don't have education, they don't have other opportunities. Whereas if we can assist with education, then the children will hopefully then, move to the cities where they've got better opportunities, better jobs. So yeah, it's a little bit idealistic, but in Europe, as you're saying, that's why you're able to reforest, because people are moving to cities and they don't want to live in the forest anymore, in the country. So that can be part of the incentive side of it. I think other than that, also what we creating nodes of development outside the park. So for instance, if we're going to build a school or health center, we don't build it in there, we build it in a village that's outside the park, again trying to just draw people outside. So various mechanisms to try and drive the development and growth outside of the parks. But ultimately, if the population just continues to grow, I think at some point we will have to take a decision on it and say, look, this is now compromising the park. And then the last one key there, and we've kind of mentioned already, is obviously just focus on tangible results. I mean, the best marketing we can do is to show the results. And so that, that's a big focus of ours, is to always to make sure there's clear results, there's delivery on those results, and we're accountable where we don't succeed. So you mentioned the governance earlier in terms of the not being judge and jury, and while it's a good model as well because of the accountability. And that's just quickly there. You've got the government, which is still the sovereign, they still own the land, they still make the policies, they still make the laws. We don't try to take anything away from that. We're not trying to privatize or anything like that. We've also got a park board for every park. So that's which made up of us and our government partners, and in some cases community are directly on those boards as well. So the park management reports to the local board. And then you've got the management, which is appointed by us, and we have control over the management. So the management is fully AP, but then we're accountable to the park board, which is half AP, half government, and then obviously the government itself, which is the sovereign owners of the land. So just the 3 M's, which is also just a little bit of, we've spoken about as we've gone through, but just to kind of formalize how we structure it, which we call mandates, management, and money. So the mandate is our agreement with government. As I said, 20-year at least, if we can. Clear roles and responsibilities. I mentioned a little bit there. We don't want the grey areas. Management. We then appoint management. We pay them. We reward. We discipline. We do everything that we work on 5-year business plans for each park. So it's very clear what the plan is. And then with an annual, 5-year budget, but annually updated. So it's kind of a rolling 5-year business plan and budget. And then we have the 3 pillars, which is basically biodiversity conservation, park revenue generation, and community development. And then, as I said, it's underpinned by the governance, finance, and infrastructure. This is also a little bit, just maybe a little bit of more information on this one, is it's a bit of a revision. We used to have law enforcement as one of our pillars, and I'll get a little bit to the end, one of our biggest challenges that we've got. But it's been one of our biggest criticisms, and some of you might have felt it in your areas, where we get accused of fortress conservation and neocolonialism and all of these kind of things. So one of it is just, a lot of it's obviously not true, but we've got to manage these perceptions. So we're kind of downplaying the law enforcement component in terms of what the focus is. And that is the reality. I mean, we don't do law enforcement for the sake of law enforcement. We do it for biodiversity conservation. Whereas before it was like law enforcement was one of our pillars. We're there to do law enforcement, and that's where some of this paramilitary kind of accusations came, which is, as I say, it's not accurate. I mean, if there was no threat, we wouldn't have law enforcement. We could just focus on doing the biodiversity work. So, but just as a little bit of more information as to why you don't see law enforcement there, but it is very much part of biodiversity conservation and very much a fundamental for, in fact, often for community development as well. If you don't have that rule of law, it's very difficult to allow the communities to develop or to enable them to develop. And then obviously money. We need to have either revenue or donor funding to fund our activities. As I said, each park operates its own business unit with its own business plan, and we can talk a bit to that. This is just a summary. You probably know it. Currently 12 countries, 22 protected areas. I don't think that's really too much. And this is just a little bit of sort of some of the expansion. As I'm back to the 161, the green are already what we've managed, and the sort of red or brownish there, depending on what the color looks like, is some of the ones we're looking at now. So I mentioned already Luengi Luiana and Mavinga, Gambela in Ethiopia. Those are kind of our ones that are on the boil at the moment. We're looking at the Burkina side of W and Ali on Burkina Faso, Kamwe in Cote d'Ivoire. Kundalungu is also quite far advanced in DRC. And then Levushimanda I mentioned as a national park adjacent to the Bangwelu. So those are just some of the parks that we probably got in the pipeline coming up. Kadepo, also northern Uganda, very interesting, but that's probably a little bit further off. And just seeing the growth from the start, the Majeti Lua, and then these are just relative sizes. So you can see some of them are massive, like Enedi, Chinko, massive areas. There's a number with Barangilo and Boma, the most recent ones. So we say currently 20 million hectares under management. Actually, it's a bit more, but we only sort of categorize the ones that we're actively managing, but we've actually got a mandate for slightly bigger than 20 million. And the nice thing as well is since we've started, it's not only our 22 parks, a lot of other people, as I mentioned, are doing a good job as well and are also using the collaborative management model. So currently there's probably 46 in Africa. You can see there's some we've spoken about at lunch, Gorongosa, Frankfurt Zoological Society, where we are now, and various other organizations that are also actively managing now. So it is quite a successful.
What does this mean? I'm not very clear. I mean, it means that your approach, okay, of collaborative, let's say managing parks as an NGO, how it has expanded in Africa. Is that what you want to show?
Yeah.
So it's like you've been pioneers and then you created a contagion effect in other organizations?
Exactly, yeah. So a lot of other people have used that model now or variations of it and for their own, and now you can see the expansion. So the green is African parks. Those are our ones. And then all the different colors, the different organizations. So if it was only us, we'd be sitting only around our 22, whereas with everybody else now, it's sitting at 46.
Gonaresu would be one of them?
Yeah, exactly. So we've got Frankfurt Zoological Society.
And Gorongosa that we saw is also there, okay?
Yeah, Gorongosa. Virunga, Peace Parks Foundation. NOAA is actually an interesting one, and because that's actually an organization that we've got what we call an incubation program. So it's where other aspiring NGOs or developing NGOs who maybe don't have the experience or the track record can come under our incubation. So they've got their own management, their own funding, but we'll help them with, for instance, our standard operating procedures, our management skills. Some of our people can go and help them and do audits, etc., like that, just to help them get going. And so, whether we've done it well or not, but we've got 20 years experience, and just to help people not have to reinvent the wheel and learn from scratch, they can learn from us and sort of give them a foot up to get going quicker.
So I think looking at that graph where you see some massive transition in the model of managing national parks in Africa, and what Luis told us, the WWF project fits there.
Yeah.
Okay, and he said how he negotiated that kind of transition of mandate. Okay, all that Hugo said, like at the beginning they were like technical assistants or whatever, and now okay, we're gonna manage it with you, like co-management is within that group. And Gorongosa, what Pedro showed, exactly the same. So it's a revolution, a continental revolution in the way that parks are being managed. And I think that's also related to what, you remember Luis sitting there and saying, I mean, there was a moment in which I thought Africa was hopeless. Do you remember that? I mean, there was no hope because everything, all the parks are being destroyed. And then he said, but something changed and now we are getting good news from Africa. Correlate that with that graph, okay? And then you can think about how this could happen in South America and other places and what is coming in other continents, okay?
Absolutely, creating local capacity. But I would still argue local capacity can be more effective if it's under a private organization than if it gets sucked into government. And that's all governments across the world. They're just, they're not as effective, as efficient as private enterprise. So, but we absolutely want to develop local capacity. And if you look at across our portfolio, I think 98% of our employees are host country nationals. So, in terms of the skills and that, they're there and we develop those skills within those countries. So we want local people to manage their own parks, but we still think it can be done better under a private organization rather than under a government structure because of the inherent limitations of government structures. But absolutely, I mean, the community-run one is, I think, a little bit more difficult and maybe a bit more controversial because there is an argument as why can't communities just run their own land? And there's not many models that I'm aware of in Africa anyway where that's been successful. Namibia is probably one exception where there's some very well-run community conservancies. But I think there's still quite a long way to go between, first of all, having the right governance structures in communities, the skills, as you said, you've got to increase the capacity. But also, and it's something I'll talk to just at the end in terms of the biggest challenges, there's got to be a good revenue generation for those communities from nature, which, there's some innovative ideas around that, but none of them are really working that well, apart from ecotourism. So where that does work, that can be, or hunting. But yes, I think that is a little bit idealistic, that I think if you could get community governance structures, community skills, community funding, that they then basically run their own protected areas would probably be the ideal situation. But I think it's quite a way off in most areas that we're in now. But we definitely, as part of our programs, we do try and develop those structures where we're going to be developing conservancies in South Sudan or working in GMAs. That's part of the plan anyway. It's just outside of the core protected areas. So we still think you've got to have that core and then as a model. But once those structures are in place and they're working, maybe in 20 years they could take over the national park as well. But I think for now we still think it's more effective. But absolutely doing it with local people. It's not that we want to bring in a whole bunch of expats and run it from far. And as I say, currently probably 98% of our employees are host country nationals. So we do drive that, yeah. The rangers are generally seconded to us, so they still, because there's quite often legislation that's specific around, for instance, carrying firearms, being able to make an arrest. You actually have to be a government registered officer to be able to do that. So they'll be seconded to us, but we normally do like a screening to make sure that they're up to our standards. We'll do what we call a BFR, a basic field ranger training course. And if people can't make it the course, they'll then drop out, and we will kind of filter off, the bad guys. But anyone who makes the grade, who cuts it, and as I say, often the people, it's not that they're poor rangers, they just don't have equipment or training or anything like that. So once we put them through the training, give them the right equipment, make sure they get a monthly salary, basic stuff like that, then the guys perform. So we generally take on majority of the staff that are there. But here and there, the poor performers or the bad managers, we will get rid of. Also, it's quite nice if it's a completely new park just to have one or two African parks people, so we get the right culture, the right DNA, into the organization. So even if there's a good management team there, we might bring a park manager in from outside who's already had experience in another African park just to make sure we get the proper practices in place. But I mean, just an example, Matusadana, because we're in Zimbabwe, I would say almost all our management team there were already parks and wildlife, either from Matusadana or from somewhere else. There, Daniel Satole, who's our community manager there, one of our top guys, he was there before. Magomba, the law enforcement, was head of law enforcement. He's still there. And we've got Mike Pelham's a park manager who actually worked in Matusadana 20 years ago and left and has now come back. So, the guys are the whole team was really, yeah, that's right. They were all there with WCS before us. So a lot of the times they just stay on and just come under the African Parks umbrella. Yeah.
It's important that you can fire people that
yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and on management level, it's relatively easy because those are directly employed by us. On a ranger level, it's sometimes more difficult, and that's, again, some of the lessons learned. In all our mandates, we have that there, that we can hire and fire, but it's quite difficult to fire government employees sometimes. So they're seconded to us. But then, and so the easiest, which is not ideal, but the easiest, so they'll be moved to another park. So we say, well, we don't want them, but if you can't fire them, then we want them out of our area, which, Matusadana problem might become a kind of reserve problem then. But yeah, we can get rid of people in theory. In practice, it's not always that easy. Yeah. But on management, absolutely, because they're direct employees of ours, and so yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, first of all, it's to make clear we're not a humanitarian or development agency. We are a conservation agency. So that is our core business, and that is why we're there. Having said that, you're not going to succeed in conservation without communities. And also, to my earlier point, communities and humanity in general is reliant on nature. So it's so closely linked. So while we won't go in, I mean, for instance, if there's a crisis of refugees coming out of Sudan, we're not the organization that's going to go in and assist them. However, where this community is reliant on a protected area or vice versa, that's where our role is to make sure the protected area is well managed and functioning for those communities. Now, the benefit for them, that's where it becomes a bit tricky. So obviously, as you're well aware, we do have community programs. But I think for me, and it's a little bit, I've got a slide right at the end, where if there's a direct benefit to those communities from the natural resource that we're managing anyway, then you're in an ideal situation, because then our core business is supporting those communities directly, rather than us having to branch out and do healthcare or whatever else, which we do a little bit of. I mean, Ozala, for instance, is probably one of the most advanced healthcare ones that we've got. So we do that, but we don't do that for its own sake. We do it because it's linked to protected area, either because we need the community to support it or because the communities are reliant on that protected area. It's a very long-winded answer, but I think that's where the differentiation comes. But we do need, and when I say we, African Parks, I think the sector in general needs innovative ways for communities to get direct revenue off protected areas to really be a game changer.